Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I have a great privilege tonight to have some wonderful philosophers on the channel, and we're going to be talking about this book, Applied Ethics, an Impartial Introduction. And so we have here with us some of the authors of the book, and also Danny from Phil Talk. So we have Dr. Liz Jackson, Dr. Dustin Crummett, and Dr. Ty Goldschmidt. And so we are just going to have a discussion about some of the difficult topics that are discussed in this book. And so, Liz, do you want to start by just telling us a bit about the book?
Yeah, definitely. So it's actually funny. The book started off, I don't know, Ty, if you remember this, but it actually started off as just an abortion book. So Ty and I were going to write a book about abortion. We sent it off to some publishers and everyone said, that's way too narrow. You need to talk about more topics. And so then we were kind of trying to figure out what topics should we include. And it just got to the point where we were like, we need some more people. And so then we brought Dustin and Becca on. And then it was cool too, because each of us kind of had a little bit of a expertise or focus on different sections of the book. And so it was nice to kind of be able to bring in different experts on different topics. So I guess maybe I'll say kind of as an overview of the book so people can know what the main things we discussed are. So we talk about 6 topics. There's 6 sections, and then within each section, there's 3 chapters. So the topics are abortion, animal ethics, environmental ethics, charitable giving, punishment, and disability. And so then kind of within each of those, we basically split it up into 3 parts. And in some cases, what it's doing, it's giving 3 of the main views on that question. So in the charity section, just as an example, there's kind of 3 views of charity. The first is that charity is a good thing, but it goes above and beyond our moral duties. I think that's a lot of people think that's the intuitive view. If you give to charity, that's good, but it's not like you're doing something morally wrong if you don't give to charity. And then, so we call it the supererogatory view. Supererogatory means above and beyond your moral duties. Then there's the obligatory view, which is the view that we have an obligation, a moral obligation to give to charity. And some people even argue we have a moral obligation to give quite a lot to charity. Maybe, 50% plus of our income, depending on how much income you make. And then there's a third view that we talk about, and we call it charity skepticism. And we kind of cover a couple different views in that chapter, but in that chapter, we basically explore different versions of the view that giving to charity is morally bad or morally wrong, or they're sort of in some way skeptical of giving to charity. So that's an example of a section where we sort of cover 3 different views on one topic. And then on some of the other sections, like environmental ethics, we sort of do 3 different topics that are all related to environmental ethics. On the disability section, we actually spend a chapter talking about what is a disability, and then we cover 2 opposing views, one that says disabilities are mere differences, one that says they're bad differences. So I won't go through every single chapter, but hopefully that's a little bit of a helpful overview and kind of how we came to, how the book sort of came together.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so just going around, what was everybody's favorite topic in the book?
Where does a round start? Maybe the panels on my video are different from others, so I'm not sure where rounds start.
Okay, let's start with Dustin. What was your favorite topic to write about?
Yeah, I should apologize, by the way, for the poorness of my setup here. I moved from Germany to Virginia, and then from Virginia to Washington State. So I'm here in my new apartment, just sitting on an air mattress, and I haven't had a haircut in a while. So I look very shabby. But
I'm in the basement. That's why I put the background on. Turn into a 4 Yorkshireman skit.
I have cats jumping around behind me. Yeah, I would say probably my favorite one to write was the one about wild animals. we have a chapter that deals with questions about our obligations to wild animals. A lot of it is about this question that some philosophers have begun discussing within the last few years, really, of if it ever becomes the case that we gain the ability to like significantly improve the condition of wild animals through, I mean, there are some things we do right now, eliminating parasites, vaccinating against certain diseases. We do those basically for ourselves, but you might do those to help wild animals too. Maybe there are more drastic things we could do, gene drives, genetic editing, this sort of stuff. So a lot of people have started wondering, well, as we master these technologies better, is it the case that we should sort of intervene in the natural world to try to make wild animals better off, or should we just leave it alone? It's not any of our business, this sort of stuff. So I wrote that chapter, and that was probably my favorite one to write. It's a topic that hasn't been discussed too much. It's definitely not discussed in like introductory books very much. But I think it's an important and interesting topic.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll hear a little bit more about the controversy part of it later on. Ty, what about you? What was your favorite topic to write about?
Well, I suppose I shouldn't say wild animals because Dustin wrote on that one, right? I wrote, that's a hard question. I think I'm quite equally, found it as equally fun or not fun, mainly fun to write on the topics that I wrote on. I wrote quite a bit on the abortion section, quite a bit on the animal ethics section and the poverty section. I mean, it was a co-authored business, so a lot of us had hands in a lot of different chapters, and some of us didn't touch specific chapters or so on. And of those chapters that I wrote, abortion, animal ethics, poverty chapters, well, some of them, I'd say I had as much fun writing all of them.
How about you, Liz?
Yeah, I was sort of torn on this question. I think I helped Ty write some of the charitable giving stuff, so that might be kind of my runner-up. I really enjoyed, especially the obligatory view, the view that we have an obligation to give to charity. I think people find it counterintuitive, but I think there's pretty compelling arguments that we have an obligation to give to charity. And I just kind of enjoyed writing that chapter. It was also funny to, the charity skepticism chapter sort of evolved over time, but Ty and I sort of together wrote the first half. It was a very difficult chapter to write because the idea that it's morally wrong to give to charity is difficult to defend. And, you're trying to be impartial. You're trying to give both sides of things. And we were like, oh, this is hard. So I don't know if that made it my least favorite, but it just was difficult. But I think the one I actually enjoyed the most, I did a lot of the work on the disability section, which was the last section. And one of the controversies we cover there is this debate between the mere difference view and the bad difference view. So the mere difference view says that having a disability makes you in some way non-standard, like physically, but it's not bad in and of itself. The bad difference view would say that having a physical disability is bad in and of itself, at least in the sense that it detracts from your well-being. And, a lot of people, I think, intuitively, and I've actually taught this debate in some of my classes as well. I think a lot of people intuitively think like, oh, the bad difference view of disability just has to be correct. That's just clearly the case. People with disabilities are worse off. But one thing that I think is really interesting is that people with disabilities actually report quite a bit of happiness and life satisfaction, and actually say they wouldn't prevent their disabilities if they had the choice. And a lot of people who I think say the bad difference view is obviously true. Of course, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them have never been disabled. And so I think they're kind of making an assumption, but there's at least something to be said for the idea that we should trust people's self-reports of well-being rather than saying you're worse off and you're better off and blah, blah, blah. So, I think there's a lot of more to be said here. But Elizabeth Barnes, if you're interested in this question, read our book, right? But Elizabeth Barnes has a really cool book that's called The Minority Body. And she kind of defends a version of the mere difference view. And I got to read quite a bit of that book to write this. And I really enjoyed that. And I I found the arguments compelling. I don't know if I would say I'm at the point where I would say the mere difference view is just true of all disabilities, no matter what. But I think there's a lot of interesting arguments for it that people often overlook. So I think that was probably my favorite chapter.
All right. Now, I wanted to ask, who should be reading your book? Is it like just for professionals? Is it for students? Is it what kind of background do you need?
Everyone should immediately buy the book.
Okay.
Buy several copies, actually.
Several copies.
Just in case you lose one, or maybe you want to read 2 chapters
I mean,
simultaneously.
it's holiday season, maybe for Hanukkah, Christmas,
Christmas coming up, yeah.
whatever, New Year's.
Well, I want to answer that
Give it a
because
gift.
I'd say this book is really, really accessible. I don't have a background in philosophy, and it was very helpful to me. Like, I understood the book, and I learned a lot from it, and it's very accessible. So even people who have no background in philosophy, it's really good. But what did you think, Danny? Because you read this, and I would like to know, what did you think the book does well, and what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I wanted to reinforce what you said. There are 2 things I think the book does really well is that it appeals to people that don't have a background. I teach philosophy on a high school level. The average age of my students is 17. And we read through we're in the middle of the abortion chapter right now. And they understand it. They can engage with it. It inspires discussion. And they didn't even know what philosophy was before that year. A lot of the scheduling, they just found themselves in my classroom. And here they are talking about abortion in an impartial way, right? That I had to tell them, look, you're going to have to drop the Twitter wars, the Facebook fights, and everything that you know about this topic. Leave it at the door. This is how a philosopher or a set of philosophers might talk about the issue. And so I think those 2 things, that it appeals to anybody. I'm from the teenage students that I teach to I think even professionals. I think it can function as a textbook. And that it really leaves behind the partiality and the polarization, and so I would say that that's what the book does really well.
Yeah, I think we wanted it to be accessible to anyone while still being sort of philosophically rigorous enough and in depth enough that it could be useful to, also people who have philosophical training but are looking to learn more about applied ethics in particular, that sort of thing.
I hope we do reach a wide audience. It's supposed to have a friendly and accessible style. It has many pedagogical features, bolded terms and offset boxes and various features that make it visually, I hope, appealing. That said, I don't think it's superficial either. I think that it would be useful for the general reader, for undergraduate classes too, but even for maybe professional, I don't know, maybe I'm deceiving myself, but I think maybe even a professional philosopher who's not familiar with this territory, who maybe who hasn't taught applied ethics before and needs a resource to start off, it'll give a very good coverage of the area and the main ideas in it, and I hope in the end in some depth too.
I think I'll add to this as well. I think 2 things that I think set the book apart is we try to cover both a combination of kind of older, like pretty classic debates like abortion, charitable giving, they've been talked about quite a bit, but then also some topics that I think are maybe newer on the scene, or there's been like more of a recent interest in. So I think disability would fall under that. I think the wild animal stuff would fall under that. And so I think that's one kind of strength of the book, is that it sort of has both the classic stuff, but also some newer, more contemporary stuff. And the other thing too is, like, a lot of applied ethics books, it'll be like a short introduction, and then what they'll do is they'll actually just take original articles written by people whose arguments we're summarizing, but it'll be like, the Thompson violinist argument reprinted, or the Marquis future of life argument reprinted. And what we try to do, we don't actually reprint arguments, we put them in our own words, and we put them in really simple, often try to do like 3 to 4 premise arguments. So with the Thompson argument, it's a famous argument that says, even if the fetus is a full-blown person with full-blown moral rights and moral standing, it still might not be wrong to have an abortion. And there's this thought experiment where you're kidnapped, and then you wake up next to this violinist, and the violinist is in the hospital, and in a serious has some serious health issues, such that they need to actually use your body and your fluids to survive. And then after 9 months, they'll be able to kind of go and survive on their own, but they're dependent on your body for 9 months. And so then Thompson kind of asks, well, what intuition do we have about this? And a lot of people do have the intuition that it would be nice for you to stay plugged into the violinist. But if you did say, I don't want to lay here for 9 months, then it wouldn't be morally wrong for you to unplug and kind of walk away. And so at minimum, what this would show, if you bought that that story and thought it was analogous to abortion, it would at least show that at least cases of rape, because remember, you're kidnapped, right? In cases of rape, abortion is permissible, but then you can kind of modify it to get a stronger conclusion. Anyway, sorry, I'm going a little bit on a tangent. The point was just that we take a case like that or an argument like that, and we try to put it into really a 3-premise argument. So premise 1 says unplugging from the violinist is not morally wrong. Premise 2 says that having an abortion is relevantly similar to unplugging from the violinist. So premise 3, therefore, abortion is not morally wrong. So we really try to break it down and then show, okay, if you deny premise 1, here's what that would look like. If you deny premise 2, here's what that would look like. And I think it actually is really helpful to kind of see both the structure of the argument, but then also the ways out.
I also wanted, and this kind of speaks to, I guess the title, Applied Ethics. A lot of people do divide ethics, and you mentioned this in the first couple pages, in terms of metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. And it's quite a heavy task to kind of just start at applied ethics, because a lot of the resources to kind of tackle these ethical dilemmas or questions and is to maybe rely on moral theories, and that is under normative ethics. And then normative ethics might have a kind of standing on metaethics, right? So there's this whole foundation, and in the book, you definitely there's a lot of normative ethics in the book. You go over different moral theories that might help you get to some answers or reply or object or whatnot. I guess the question is that where do you see the philosophical or the moral the professional landscape? Are a lot of philosophers doing applied ethics, or do you see a lot of philosophers doing metaethics? I just wanted y'all to kind of speak to this kind of division in the branch.
I don't know if I obviously haven't done an empirical survey to know how many philosophers are focusing on each of these areas of ethics. They do inform each other, like you say, so it's helpful if someone doing the one might do the other. As you say, you might start from very general ethical theories about what makes an action right or wrong, right? What makes, giving charity or saving people, in dire need, right? What makes murder or stealing wrong, and what common ingredient is there to these? You might start developing a theory about that, and then just get your verdicts about the controversial issues by applying the theory. So once you know what the general ingredient is that makes right actions right, and wrong actions wrong, you might then go to the controversial cases and see, is this ingredient present? And thus, is this controversial topic abortion, or animal ethics, or punishment, or should we conclude that the relevant actions are right or wrong? You might do that. And some people do that, as we illustrate in the book. For the most part, though, I think applied ethics is done in a more messy way, right? I think for the most part, there are these sort of somewhat independent intuitions, arguments, thought experiments that philosophers draw from, and more directly from those reach conclusions about these controversial issues. So while they do inform, they can inform each other, these areas of ethics. Typically, things aren't neat and tidy.
Yeah. You might think, I mean, one example that might be helpful that I've thought about before is if you think about, say, engineering, there's a way in which engineering is like applied physics, say, right? What you're doing is, you need to make sure all these physical forces balance out or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean that an engineer needs to figure out like what is the right interpretation of quantum mechanics before they can go build a building there, right? There might be sort of things that don't drill all the way down to like the most fundamental physical principles, but that are kind of mid-level principles that they can apply that will be good enough. So yeah, lots of applied ethicists, I think, think that they can get by with kind of drawing analogies with other cases, or sort of, don't kill people. You shouldn't kill people. Like, we all agree about that. We might disagree. Different ethical theories will disagree about why you shouldn't kill people. Is it because it violates the categorical imperative? Is it because it reduces utility? Blah, blah, blah. But surely we can agree, like, at least usually don't kill people. And then maybe if we can get that, we can apply it to certain topics, or, so yeah, different people have different views about exactly how. And then you also have people who, say, like Peter Singer, who are very, very confident in their theoretical judgments, and they think even, the very plausible seeming mid-level principles and case, all that has to go if it conflicts with, abstract moral principles that they think they've figured out. And so different people have different approaches about how to go through with it.
Well, I'm wondering, do you have personally strong convictions about these topics, and which ones, and was it hard for you to put aside your personal convictions in order to present the best arguments?
I can start. On some of them I do. So I think I do. So I definitely think, for example, about charity, that giving to charity is morally required, not just supererogatory or above and beyond. And I definitely think it's not morally wrong. And I actually think, like I mentioned before, writing that chapter was a little difficult. I was trying my best to put on my charity skepticism hat, but some of the objections, and we present an argument, and then we do objections and replies. And I think Ty and I were just like, we cannot come up with a reply to this objection. It was just really difficult. So we were like, I think we ended up being like, leave it up to the reader. Like, as the reader, how would you reply to this? So in some cases it was hard.
We ultimately do in the final version say that the Hardin argument just doesn't work. That's one of the few places. Garrett Hardin has this famous argument that, look, if you're on a lifeboat and the lifeboat's about to capsize and there are people drowning, you can't pull them into the lifeboat, right? Because then just everybody will die. And he thinks, giving to charities that, say, feed starving people, it's like trying to bring the drowning people into your capsizing lifeboat. Too many people in the world. You got these other countries that are way overpopulated. If you try to help these starving people, then you're just going to make the problem worse. And and that argument ultimately is just kind of empirically wrong.
Yeah. When you look at the way, this charity statistics, things are just drastically improving. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dustin.
Yeah.
But
then we talk about sort of other arguments that say, well, okay, maybe that argument is wrong, but maybe, say, people should be more focused on trying to bring about institutional reform as opposed to providing direct aid, this sort of stuff. Sort of more sophisticated kind of charity skeptical positions. But yeah, anyway, go on.
I guess, I'm trying to think what other topics we covered I have an opinion on. So I definitely also think eating factory farm meat. Well, I definitely think factory farming is morally wrong. Probably eating factory farm meat is also morally wrong. So that's another thing, at least as I'm thinking about the topics we covered, that I do have an opinion on. I do think, though, one thing I think philosophers are good at, there's many, many, many things they're very bad at, but I think they are actually pretty good about, often cases, being able to see two sides of an issue, and being able to admit when, like, oh, that's a good point, or that's a good argument. And actually, I really like to structure my classes where, you know, either I'll have a reading for A and a reading for not A, or like in class, I'll give two arguments with contradictory conclusions, and then make the students kind of wrestle with that and like defend both of them, and really try to present both sides of things. And I do think that that can be a strength of philosophy. And so I found it kind of fun to kind of have to take these various positions and try to give as plausible a defense of them as possible. So at least for me personally, I don't think it was super difficult, besides maybe, the hardened one.
If I have to answer too, I suppose I kind of feel the same way as Liz and Dustin. Maybe I shouldn't say that, because I don't want to give the readers the impression that, you know, we all have such strong agreements. Our book is just, you know, one-sided. Yeah, I don't know. One gets used to, in philosophy, seeing clever arguments on both sides of an issue, and the sort of sense that that it's hard, you know, to come up with philosophical arguments that would persuade a lot of people, let alone just anyone, or everyone. On some issues, I suppose I do have strong views. On some issues, I have views at all. But I'm kind of, so far as the philosophical arguments go, often skeptical that they can do the work that I want them to do and to buttress those views. So even where I do have a strong view on a topic, right, I think, oh, yeah, this is right, this is wrong, for whatever reasons, you know, maybe I was brought up that way. Maybe my religion teaches me this. Maybe, you know, whatever reason I have for thinking this is right or wrong, even strongly. It's often the case that when I come to the philosophical arguments in both directions, I'm kind of torn or underwhelmed, or I can see that the philosophical arguments, so far as they go, aren't going to do all the work that I wish they could.
I think I would say that among the chapters that I wrote, I sort of varied. I mean, there were some where I had very strong feelings, and then there are others where I'm just kind of dumbfounded. It just seems like none of the answers can be right, but like one of them has to be. So the wild animal chapter, I think the like pro-intervention view, that like if you could help wild animals, you should do it. I really think that's correct, you know. So I had very strong feelings on that chapter. But then there's this chapter about our obligations to future generations, and you get into these puzzles that Derek Parfit raised that are called the non-identity problem, about these situations where you do something that it's going to make future people worse off, but it will also change who the people that exist in the future are. And so, maybe if we release a bunch of pollution now, say, that will make people living in the year 2200 worse off than the people living in the year 2200 would be if we didn't. But it also, because of the butterfly effect, you know, different economic policies mean different people will get different jobs, they'll meet different people, they'll conceive children at slightly different times. So totally different people are going to be living in 2200. So you might think, well, wait a minute, those people in 2200, they wouldn't exist unless we release all the pollution. So what are they going to be complaining about, right? And so it seems like there are these courses of action where it seems like there has to be something objectionable, but it's very hard to identify who the victim could be. I really find those cases just very puzzling. So there, you know, I tried to, for all of them, basically, whether I agreed or disagreed with what I was discussing, I wanted to make sure that just what I said was an accurate representation. You know, if I showed it to someone who held this position, they would agree, like, yes, that's what I thought, right? Yeah, sometimes I was discussing views I rejected. In the non-identity problem case, I was just look, here are all the options, here are problems, potential problems, and like I genuinely don't know exactly what to say about that. So yeah, for me it varied.
There's something that Ty said that kind of got me thinking about moral convergence. Like, for instance, Rebecca is a devout Christian, and I'm an atheist. But there's a lot of moral convergence with respect to maybe some issues on abortion. For instance, I think that there's something really wrong if someone's aborting a fetus if they're not content with their sex. It just seems like that's kind of sketchy to me. But I have my own reasons, and presumably Rebecca has different reasons. But nonetheless, we agree that you ought not abort your whatever's in the womb for those sorts of reasons, right? So I did y'all speak to any of that in terms of how there's a lot of moral convergence, and then like half the discussion is kind of like what is motivating us versus whether the moral proposition is true or false.
I should maybe not answer that directly, but to just some relevant background for the listener. I don't know exactly the religious or non-religious, as the case may be, views of all my co-authors, but I think we have different religious backgrounds and convictions, and I think that we understand that our readers will have different religious backgrounds and convictions. I think there's nothing in our book that is particularly religious or anti-religious, or depends on any particular religious outlook or non-religious outlook. I think that readers of different backgrounds can maybe benefit from, insofar as their religion teaches them that this action is right or this action is wrong, maybe they could benefit from seeing what philosophical reasons could be said for that view. And maybe they could even benefit from seeing, what others on the other side have to say about it too. That doesn't directly answer your question, though. I think, in this context, it's helpful to know that our book doesn't have a particular religious or in any direction sort of flavor, though I hope that religious believers as well as skeptics will have much to gain from it.
Yeah, I took it. I take it the question maybe is also, even apart from kind of different religions or these sorts of things, there's also a lot of convergence among different philosophical positions, different moral theories. Like I said, they're all going to agree that usually you shouldn't kill people, say. I think there's something about that that's kind of interesting from the perspective of moral epistemology. I guess the reason that that's true is that your belief that you shouldn't go around killing people is not something that you derive from a theory. Maybe it is at the end, but initially you formed it in some much more immediate way, right? You didn't go through some long chain of reasoning. That's kind of an immediate intuition or an immediate deliverance of conscience. And when people come up with moral theories, one of the tests for them is whether they do tolerably well at not coming up with extremely absurd seeming conclusions, right? Moral theories that don't, moral theories that would imply that it's okay for me to just walk out and shoot a random person on the street or something, just to test out my gun, those would be rejected for the reason that they had that implication, right? There's quite a lot of convergence, I think, partly because different theories are developed, partly to explain intuitions about cases and to explain sort of plausible mid-level principles. And I think that people have the ability to know that those judgments are correct, those more applied judgments are correct, even if they've never, thought about ethical theories, or even if, they don't, they haven't thought about what their religion has to say about whether it's okay to kick a puppy in the face, or, they still think, well, that's wrong.
Dustin's definitely a cat person, I can tell.
Yeah.
Well, Dustin, I'm kind of interested that you said that, one of the things that you feel strongly about is the intervention with wild animals. Because to me, that sounds like kind of a fringy view, because it would require kind of disturbing the ecological environment and stuff. So can you tell us, explain why you feel that way about that?
Oh yeah, it definitely is a fringy. I mean, people, when you say this to them, people get mad at you. Like, it's not just that they think you're some crazy I mean, they do think you're some crazy person, but they wish ill on you. They really, it makes them mad. So yeah, it's true. I was just extolling the fact that our common sense judgments tell us all this stuff. But then there are other times when we realize that our common sense judgments just can't be right because we have this argument against them that's so good. Yeah, I mean, what is the argument for interventionism? Well, I mean, there are so many wild animals. There are trillions of them. And like, animals matter, their suffering is bad and their well-being is good. And they have it awfully tough. I mean, most wild animals die in infancy. They are subject to predation, to the elements, to starvation, diseases, all sorts of stuff. And so if we can do something, now, of course, you might worry, are we just going to mess it up and make things worse? And that sort of, yeah, I mean, okay, that's a serious worry. But suppose we really know that it's going to work somehow, right? And there are some things we have done that did. I mean, we've eliminated certain parasites and it didn't destroy the ecosystem or anything. It just means that animals are a little better off. In those cases, I think the argument is just, look, animal suffering is bad, animal flourishing is good. We can make there be more flourishing and less suffering. We can help these animals that will be in a really bad way if we don't do it. So we should do it. And people, like I say, they get really mad and then they come up with objections. And I think that the objections just don't work. So
I actually, not to, I don't know, stir the pot even more, I actually agree with Dustin on this. And I just wanted to add to that too. Like, I feel like at least one of the biggest pushbacks I get is like, oh, you're just going to mess up and make things worse. But you have to remember, that's not an objection to, in principle, intervening if we can kind of do the research and figure out the best ways to actually make wild animals' lives better. And of course, it might be that a lot of interventions that we've done in the past have been worse. But I don't think that is an objection to this idea that in principle, in the future, when we have better technology or more information, that these kind of interventions couldn't be good and couldn't help animals flourish and live better lives and have a lot less pain. So I just want to kind of flag that as, like, I think a big objection people give that I actually think isn't actually attacking the actual view. I think it's attacking like a weak version of the view or something.
And it is a little tricky because when you think about kind of small scale cases, if somebody finds some baby birds that are going to die because their mama died or something, or they got kicked out of the nest or something, and they take care of the baby birds and then release them. That's a form of intervention in nature, right? And people do think, oh, that's good. When you talk about doing it systematically, that's when people get worried. But I think that's a little bit, maybe you can kind of offer an error theory. Philosophers talk about error theories. An error theory is an explanation of why we might think something even if it's not true. And people have what's called status quo bias. They kind of like the way that things are, even if things weren't that way, they wouldn't like it. They tend to want to keep things the way that they are. They tend to think, if things go, if this is like the natural way for things to be, then that must make it good. Those seem to me to be biases that ultimately can't be defended. Even I actually have we were talking about religious stuff a minute ago. I have a paper giving kind of a theological argument in favor of intervention that just came out in religious studies. I think even abstracting away from that sort of stuff, I think just the ordinary, basic, just suffering is bad, all else equal. Argument is good.
Well, I couldn't tell that was your strong view by what I read in the book, and so I really do feel like it was very fair. It, as I'm reading, I love the format because everything is back and forth right away. It's like, okay, here's the reply to this argument. Here's the reply to that reply. Here's the reply to that reply. So it really helps you get the main points very clearly. Ty, what did you think was the most difficult thing to write about, and what made it difficult?
Oh, given that in my answer to the previous question, that I found everything that I did write about the most, about equally fun to write about. I don't think I can consistently say that I found anything that I wrote about more difficult than anything else. It's all stuff I've taught for a while. I'm familiar enough with the literature. I suppose the stuff that I didn't write, I would have found the most difficult. Maybe the chapters on punishment and disability, or wild animals. The chapters I didn't write would have been really hard for me to do.
What about the contractarian argument? I feel like that one was really hard.
Yeah. Okay. So to give some background, we in the part on animal ethics, we discuss various views of philosophers have put forward, defending the conclusion that we should change a lot of the practices we engage in with respect to animals. Liz already mentioned that factory farming is morally problematic. And everyone's seen these videos and is pretty shocked by them. And then there are philosophical arguments from point of view of animal welfare, animal rights, for the conclusion that our treatment of animals is wrong. There are also arguments on the other side. Okay, arguments for the conclusion that our treatment of animals, including even factory farming, is not wrong, right? And to be even-handed, we devote about equal amount of space to considering arguments on both sides. And the contractarian argument is an argument for the conclusion that our treatment of animals isn't morally wrong. Even factory farming, whatever use we want to make of animals, is not morally wrong. And this argument is quite theoretical. I suppose it depends on a moral theory called contractualism or contractarianism. I forget which is more proper. And I suppose the chapter is a little harder for me because I'm generally skeptical of these abstract moral theories. I don't think that I don't find any particularly plausible. And this is this chapter involves a little bit more treatment of abstract stuff. So you might have thought it a little bit harder or less fun to write, but not that much less fun, I suppose. Sorry to disappoint, Liz. It was okay.
It's sort of doubly theoretical, I guess, because there are also contractualists who think that contractualism is compatible with animal rights. So you have to not only work out what the right version of the theory is, but then also apply it.
There are contractualists who think that not only is it compatible with animal rights, but actually can secure animal rights.
Yeah.
Right. Though maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because I haven't at least explained what contractualism is, what the rival moral theories are, what a normative moral theory is at all, and how we might derive.
Why don't you talk about that? Yeah, tell us about that. What is it? What does that even mean? And I do know because I read the book, but explain it for those who are not familiar with this concept.
Okay. Well, a normative moral theory is an answer to the question, or one kind of class of normal moral theories, right? So an answer to the question of what makes right actions right, what makes wrong actions wrong. You might think that there's a common ingredient, that it's not a cosmic coincidence that murder is wrong and that stealing is wrong. There's something common to both of them that make them wrong, right? And the big question is, what is that? What is that common ingredient that makes all wrong actions wrong? And then we have a number of theories, a number of answers to this question. Well, here's a simple answer. Societies say so. Okay, what makes all wrong actions wrong is just that society says, murder is wrong, society says stealing is wrong. Okay. Another answer, God says so. What makes murder and stealing wrong? Well, God has prohibited both murder and stealing. There we go. Yet another answer. What makes murder and stealing wrong? Well, these cause suffering, right? And it's causing suffering, it's causing pain that makes an action wrong, and so on, right? There are quite a few moral theories that are like this, that try to tell us what the common ingredient is that makes actions right or wrong. And for each of these, we consider what might be said for the theory and what might be said against it. Besides, of course, fleshing out the theory in a little bit more detail than I've done now, than I've had the chance to do now. It would take a while. Contractualism is one of these theories. Okay, and the general idea is that and I'm putting this very roughly. Okay, the general idea is that what makes an action right or wrong is whether it would be agreed upon by rational agents in a kind of ideal situation. Okay, so supposedly all rational agents in an ideal situation would agree that murder and stealing are wrong. And why that's the case, would involve filling out some of those details. But it has in part to do with, what an agent would do behind what's called a veil of ignorance. Okay, if the agent doesn't know where one's place in the world will be, okay, and must hedge one's bet. Okay, what kind of rules would that agent agree to? And if you don't know where you're going to land up, all you know is that you're a rational agent. You might make rules stipulating that you shouldn't kill other rational agents or anything like that. But of course, animals aren't rational. So the argument goes they're outside the moral community. And rules that would be stipulated by rational agents in these ideal circumstances, this is becoming a bit of a mouthful, wouldn't protect animals. Okay, so this is a very bare bones sketch of what moral theories do, of how they might be applied, and a very rough and ready sketch of contractualism. Maybe Dustin and Liz want to fill that out a little bit, and fill in parts they think that can be corrected or more important, what I missed.
Oh yeah, I mean, I take it the thought is something like immorality is like a kind of social contract, right? It's a kind of hypothetical social contract. So you imagine these rational agents getting together, they're agreeing on rules for how that are going to govern their interactions. And the thought is from Peter Carruthers, who's the person who pushes this contractualist anti-animal rights argument. The thought is, well, the rational agents, they're getting together to govern their interactions with each other, but animals can't be party to this contract. They can't recognize these reciprocal obligations and follow the rules and all this sort of stuff. So they're going to get left out. So we'll get together and agree that, we can't hurt each other, but we're not going to make rules prohibiting people from hurting animals. This is the thought. And of course, you might immediately start to worry, well, what about human beings who, babies or people with various sorts of disabilities or whatever who can't follow the rules? What about just ordinary animal cruelty? Somebody torturing an animal in their basement or something, is it going to allow this? So you might think, well, this seems like it's going to cause problems. And there are some people who say, you might think that's a reason to reject contractualism. You might also think it's a reason to modify it. Well, maybe animals could be part of the social contract, or maybe we imagine there being trustees who represent the animals at the the drawing up of the contract, right? So there's a guy named Mark Rowlands who has written a bunch of stuff about versions of contractualism that incorporate animals and say that we have obligations to animals and so forth. So it, yeah, I mean, it gets a bit complicated, I guess, because there are so many potential moves here. But
yeah, I think the reason I found this chapter difficult is because it's just, I mean, it's kind of what Dustin was just saying, but it's not at all clear to me that even if we exclude animals from being the direct contractees, people care about animals. People don't like it when you torture puppies. And it doesn't seem like people would agree on rules that just make all those things permissible or fine. Rational agents, even if they know they wouldn't be an animal, it doesn't seem like those are the kinds of moral rules that they would be okay with. At least it's not clear to me that they would. So yeah, that I guess, yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people, before they've kind of come to this question of animal rights and factory farming, they just buy whatever food at the grocery store and they think, oh, it's fine to eat animals. Oh, it's fine to experiment on animals. But when you really dig into the philosophical arguments, there's not, I mean, it's hard to find really good arguments for this idea that doing whatever we want to animals and doing the horrible things that factory farms do to them and, experimenting on them in whichever ways we like, no matter how hurtful or painful it is for the animal, those things are just totally fine because animals have no moral rights. And so I think that was an interesting thing that actually I kind of learned when writing this book. We're trying to pull the most plausible arguments on either side, and this contractualist or contractarian argument, I think, is one of the more plausible ones, but at least personally, I don't find it that plausible. So
yeah. It might be the best of a bad lot.
Yeah.
The most plausible out of a bunch of awfully implausible seeming arguments. Yeah, that's sort of what I think.
But we gave it our best shot, and hopefully people reading the book didn't think, oh, they clearly hate this argument or something. So
hopefully the book fills out the details. It's hard on one foot to explain, and maybe it gives the wrong impression, now because it's one of the more technical, I suppose, drier arguments in the book, and it might give the wrong impression to the viewers that the book is quite dry and technical. And actually, I think for the most part we illustrated with colorful examples and analogies and so on. And if this sounds rather abstract, I suppose it's just an unfortunately chosen example. But I hope that the book would make it slower going, more accessible and friendly, and generally give a friendlier and more accessible impression than a very quick sketch of a particular argument. Very quick sketch might do.
So the way I see, like if we take the question is factory farming morally permissible? Is it impermissible? You can either, the way I see it is, you can either take a moral theory like contractualism and apply it and get an answer. You might think sort of like Bernard Williams, where that morality, our experience of it, is just too untidy, too complicated. There might be a right answer to the question. In fact, it's treated like there's a right answer to the question, but it's not going to come from like kind of like the sympathies that Ty had. That's not coming from like an a priori abstract principle or theory, perhaps. And then you have a kind of a dark figure in the background, the nihilist, right? That says, well, we can ask the question, but you can, whatever answer you're going to get is going to be a right answer, right? Like there's not going to be a fact of the matter about what you end up deciding to be permissible. Everything just has equal permissive weight. I don't know. There's the dog. So perfect. While we're on the topic of animal rights and stuff, but I guess is that what is y'all's? I think Ty already said that he's quite skeptical of some of these more abstract moral theories. Is that how y'all see Dustin and Liz? Is that how do y'all see in the same? Are y'all at the same wavelength there, or do you see it as like a kind of a Williams way, where it's just a little untidy? We can get a right answer, but it's not going to really come from one of these moral theories.
I guess I would say, I mean, I'm probably a little more a little more optimistic about theories than Ty. So I'm actually pretty sympathetic to some version of contractualism that is modified to account for obligations to animals myself. But I do think there are lots of kind of more applied judgments that it seems like there are cases where maybe you should be a little wary of, you know, abstract judgments that are very far removed from ordinary life, and so you might think there are lots of more applied judgments that I'm probably more sure about than I am about lots of very theoretical judgments, and it's also it's always very comforting when different theories converge on certain things, because then you think, well, even if I'm wrong about the theory, I'm probably still right about this other thing. And yeah, though there are also, I mean, it's a little tricky because sometimes more applied judgments can be more subject to various sorts of bias, you know, what your society happens to think, or what is in your own self-interest, or you know, what the people in your political clique believe. So I don't think it's always quite that the lower level judgments went out over the theoretical judgments. You know, if you have some, you know, very complicated thing that's influenced by all these empirical questions and potential sources of bias and things, and then you have some very pristine theoretical judgment. If A is better than B and B is better than C, then A is better than C. Maybe you should go for the pristine theoretical judgment over the messy, detailed claim here. So, yeah, I don't think that there's like an algorithm we can decide in advance that will tell us quite how to handle all these. But
yeah, we'll probably have to do some kind of reflective equilibrium where we take certain judgments about cases, certain general principles, and kind of go back and forth and sort of refine things that way. I agree with Dustin that I don't think the general will always trump the specific, or vice versa. There's a whole other problem in philosophy, though, about the unreliability of different kinds of intuitions and the unfortunate things. I mean, Dustin listed a bunch off, but there's even things like font color and like whether there's trash on the table in front of you that do influence intuitions. And you know, some people take this to be like we should just be skeptical of all intuitions. You know, we can talk about that. I'm not convinced we should go that far with it, but it is good to kind of be aware of the things that seem pretty irrational that do sometimes influence our judgments.
So did any of your views change as you wrote the book?
You mean about the topics of the book?
Yeah.
This is material I'm familiar with. I suppose I taught for a while. I don't know, maybe one or two arguments from my co-authors who wrote on chapters I was less familiar with were enlightening. So nothing much on the chapters that I wrote, since I'd considered for a while the relevant material, but there are some aspects of the chapters, and I don't think this isn't to the original points I made. I don't think the chapters are, while introductory, I don't think they're elementary. I don't think they're superficial. And so Dustin and Liz and Rebecca, in respective chapters that I didn't write, introduced some ideas that were new to me. I don't know if those ideas ever changed a prior opinion that I had, well, it converted me, so to speak, to the opposite view, insofar as I held a view at all. But they did show me that there was more to be said in this direction or that direction than I had previously thought.
I would probably report something similar. I think so a lot of my views got kind of fleshed out more as I was writing various things, and, you know, reading some of trying to think about what possible responses would be and that sort of stuff. So I don't think I changed my mind on some topics. Maybe I just got more confused, like the non-identity problem, where I'm just confused. But yeah, I don't think. I mean, I guess my views about how much of the book I had written, for instance, changed while I was writing the book. There were some trivial ways in which my views changed, but not probably high level changes about the topics, because they were things, the ones I was writing about at least were again things I had already thought about. So
Yeah, I think for me it was more like changes in levels of confidence more than it was like radically like a huge paradigm shift. So I think I've already mentioned like some of the examples, but coming to see that the contractarian argument was the best argument, one of the better arguments at least, that our treatment of animals in factory farms is permissible, I think made me more confident that factory farming's wrong. The wild animals chapter, I was already sort of sympathetic to the idea that there's at least a in principle place to be intervening with wild animals. I think I became more confident of that. I don't think my confidence that we have an obligation to give to charity like drastically went up, but it probably went up slightly. And I learned a lot writing the disability section. I think I probably became slightly more confident in the mere difference view, at least with respect to certain disabilities. But I think I also came to have the view that whether disabilities are a mere difference or a bad difference probably just depends on the disability. And there may not be like one overall answer, like all disabilities mere difference or all disabilities bad difference. So at least, I'm not like 100% sure of that, but I kind of came to have that view after writing those chapters. Oh, one view I came to hold: defining disability is very difficult. And if you read the chapter, I think it's chapter 17 maybe, where the question is, what is a disability? You'll be very disappointed. We give like tons of definitions. I think we give like over 10 definitions and end up saying like they all have counterexamples. So that is one view I hold pretty strongly. It's very difficult to define what it means to have a disability.
I noticed that because I was surprised, each of the definitions that, dictionary definitions were kind of taken apart and, destroyed as like a potentially good definition. But then it's like, you're left with nothing. It's like, okay, well, how are we defining this? And, I thought that was a really interesting part of the book. Yeah.
I feel similarly with the term illness. I think that's pretty difficult to get out, and I think that the implication is that itself might be a normative term and you're trying to define it descriptively, but they're both like used. Then there might be cases where it's being used descriptively, there are cases where it's being using normatively, so it's just those are tough terms.
On the question of definitions, this might be a point where I can advertise something else about the book. Besides the particular topics and substance of those topics, the disagreements about abortion, animal ethics, disability, or whatnot that are covered, we hope that the book conveys or imparts general philosophical skills. So we have a section that's quite heavily focused on what is it to give a definition? How do we go about testing definitions? Why are definitions philosophically important at all? So we try to impart the sort of skills of sort of conceptually fine-tuning, right? And clarifying ideas to the students. In other parts of the book, we're trying to impart argumentative skills, like how do we evaluate arguments of this form, analogical arguments, or arguments of that form, sort of theoretical, inferences to the best explanation, or arguments of this other form. Okay. And so the book, in addition to covering the particular ethical topics, we hope is kind of a nice introduction to philosophical tools that might be used and will help with those sort of transferable skills or critical thinking skills that philosophy often advertises.
Danny, if you were going to point someone to the most interesting part of the book, what did you think? What was the point that you liked the best?
I actually like one of the classic methodological thought experiments. The Singer's pond argument, the shallow pond argument, I believe it's called. I think this one you'll see all around, especially in classes on ethics and stuff. Like, it's one of the first thought experiments posed. I'm hesitant to give an exact rendition of it, but I think it's something I'm actually more comfortable to let the authors talk about it than myself. But what is this shallow pond argument that Peter Singer kind of brings up?
I take it starts with sort of an argument from analogy. So the thought is, you're walking along, you see some kid who's drowning in a shallow pond, right? You can wade in and save this kid, but you're going to ruin your very fancy suit that cost several $1,000s. And maybe you're some kind of, I don't know why you have such an expensive suit, Ty, but or it's, I mean, it has to be, to make it realistic, it has to be that expensive, I guess. So you're going to ruin your very fancy suit that you bought for business reasons or something, for that cost several $1,000s. And the thought is, look, obviously you're obligated to wade in and save this kid who's drowning. You know, it's not physically dangerous, it's shallow. Obviously you're obligated to wade in and save this kid who's drowning, even though you'll ruin your suit and lose several $1,000s. Okay. Well, we know that there are charities like the Against Malaria Foundation. If you go to GiveWell, the website GiveWell, they'll tell you what their current recommendations are. There are charities that do work in the developing world, giving money to people in need, providing malaria nets, providing medicine, all sorts of stuff. And it turns out that if you give a couple $1,000s to one of these organizations, you're likely to save the life of someone, of some child in need, as well as probably doing a lot of other good things, preventing maybe a large number of non-lethal malaria cases, this sort of stuff. And Singer thinks, look, the only difference between you just walking past the kid and letting them drown rather than ruin your suit, the only difference between that and you refusing to donate a couple $1,000s that you have to spare that you want to spend on luxuries or whatever, the only difference between letting the kid drown in the pond and refusing to donate the money to this organization that will save some kid somewhere else is that the kid in the pond is a lot closer. Right, but surely the fact that they're close to you, that you happen to be able to see them, that sort of stuff doesn't really matter. The kid is just as important, even if they're in some other country or whatever. And so, by analogy, he argues, it looks like you have an obligation to give a very large portion of your disposable income, assuming that you have some at least, to charities that will help people. And then there's also sort of a principle-based argument that says, look, if you can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important of your own, then you should do that. And you think, yeah, that sounds awfully plausible, doesn't it? Lots of moral theories will agree with it. He's a utilitarian, but people who hold to other moral theories could agree with that too. Maybe there's convergence here, right? But he thinks, well, okay, if a couple $1,000s of disposable income, that's not anywhere near as important as the life of a child who might die from malaria. So it looks like by this principle, you're obligated to make the donation. So he sort of starts out with this case and argues from the case, and then he also draws this general moral and tries to show that the general principle has the same implication. Both of them are supposed to show that we have this obligation to donate lots of our disposable income to people in need.
Yeah, a lot of students, when they first hear that, I mean, there's like something kind of immediately to wrestle with, because this is, I mean, you talked about few $1,000 suit. Now there might be a moral question as to why you should, another moral question about why you have that expensive a suit. But suppose
there's another example where you have, like, there's a person who's bleeding to death, and you can bring them into your car and drive them to the hospital, but they're going to bleed all over your seats and you'll have to get them reupholstered and, you know.
Oh yeah.
Maybe that's more. Peter,
I was thinking like $80 shoes, you know, like
Yeah.
something like that. But
Yeah,
I'm also thinking that it needn't be $1,000 suit. I mean, I think we're just talking about expensive shoes or something like that.
yeah.
yeah.
Like, I usually hear the shoes. You buy $80 shoes, and you would ruin them at the shallow pond. You would forfeit the $80. But at the cash register, if you're even, you know, with the little prompt, say, hey, do you want to donate? And let's just stipulate that in that donation, you'll be doing much good, like perhaps even saving a child. That's probable. You choose no, right? Like, so what Singer's like, what's the difference here, right? And so I think that's a really, it's something to kind of like really think about, because proximity is you know, we don't think of you're less valuable the farther you are. If my mom, you know, went to Africa to visit, she's not less valuable to me, right? Like, so no, I just thought I think that's always a great one to start with. And
sorry, about the cost of the suit. There's another example. There's another example from Peter Unger, where this guy has a Bugatti, which is like a classic car, right? This is like, you know, that's worth like a bunch of hundreds of thousands of dollars maybe, and he's restored this car. This is like his retirement plan, is he's gonna, you know, use this as collateral or something. And he's out driving the car. He doesn't drive it very often because it's such a precious thing. He's out driving it and it stalls out right on the trolley tracks. And he notices that there's an out-of-control trolley. Ethicists love out-of-control trolleys. There's an out-of-control trolley that's about to hit this kid who is on one of the tracks. Maybe the kid has his foot stuck or something. And he realizes he can run over and redirect the trolley onto the track that his Bugatti is on. So he'll save this kid, but it's going to hit his super expensive car that he cares so much about. And we think, well, surely he's gotta take the hit, right? He's gotta sacrifice his car to save this kid. But like the car, I mean, you can save a kid for much less than the sacrifice that this guy has got to make, right? So maybe that's if the cost of the suit is a worry. The Bugatti case is, you know, it seems like actually maybe even the shallow pond case understates how strong our obligations are.
I think then doesn't it go on though to be like, well, what if there's like all these shallow ponds and all these kids, and then you're like, you have an overwhelming number, and then kind of like, isn't that the situation that we're really in the world where, you know, there's an overwhelming number of needs and we, you know, can't give to all of them. So like, how many are we obligated to save? How many children are you obligated to save? You know, do you stop going on with your life as normal? Like, do you not go to work? Do you not do these things? You know, how many children? And then like, so what do you guys think about that? What's your response?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and kind of, I mean, the question it gets at is like, what is the extent of our moral obligation here? And you can even build into the case, like, let's say, you know, maybe there's a large pond or lake with a lot of kids drowning, and then there's like 50 people like standing on the side and like watching and not doing anything about it. And then you go in and save a kid, maybe you save 2 or 3 kids even, and then is there a certain point at which you're like, they need to save some kids too, and maybe you can then go on your way and go to work or go do whatever you're going to do that day? Or do you just have to keep saving kids? You know, I mean, and different people may have different like intuitions about that. But I will say one thing is like, if we've already gotten you to this point in the argument, then you already agree with the obligatory view, at least in the sense that you think we need to give some money to charity. I think you just... then we just have to work out exactly how much. And it's interesting. So Peter Singer is one of the biggest proponents of this argument. And given certain things he says, like a lot of us should be giving like 80-90% of our income to charity. And I think he himself only gives about 40%, you know? So yeah, I think there's interesting questions about the extent of our obligations, but those all fall within this same view, which would be the obligatory view. I don't know if Ty or Dustin or any of you actually
I think
have like a line you want to draw where you're like, this is our obligation, but I don't know.
I think he recently received $1 million prize that he donated to charity.
That's awesome.
I'm curious to see what future winners will do. Does this set a precedent? Are they going to be able to keep it themselves, or should they give it to charity too? Here's hoping.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is hard to draw. Travis Timmerman has this paper called "Sometimes It's Okay to Let a Child Drown," which of course is a very shocking title. But the thought is, suppose just like every 5 minutes, some hapless kid is falling in this pond, and you're just constantly dragging them out. Like, are you obligated to spend your whole life standing that, you want to take a break. You want to go see the Avengers or something, like one time in your life, even though these kids are going to drown when you do it. Are you obligated to dedicate everything? And of course you can see both the thought that, well, I mean, kids are going to die. You've got to do it, and you can maybe see the thought that, well, surely you can take a break. You can, privilege yourself in some way. But of course, as Liz was saying, the difficulty in drawing the line wouldn't be a reason not to think you've got to give a lot of money, right? If somebody tells you you should invest for retirement, and you're like, how much should I invest for retirement? And they're like, well, I don't know a specific dollar amount. You wouldn't be like, well, I'm not going to invest anything, right? So the thought that it's difficult to draw the line wouldn't show that you shouldn't give a lot, even though maybe you don't know quite how much. And
I also, is it okay if I add something to that? This is like a slightly different point, but it's still on the shallow pond thing. Like, one thing that I actually really enjoyed about writing this book was like thinking about how these different arguments might actually interact with each other. So here's a really interesting pair of intuitions that people have that I wonder if they're consistent. So we have this drowning child intuition, even if let's go with the thousands of dollars suit case, right? You should sacrifice thousands of dollars to go save this drowning child from the pond. On the other hand, it seems like at least a lot of people remember the violinist example I talked about maybe like an hour ago or something. This example where you're kidnapped and you're put in bed with this violinist, and you have to lay there for 9 months to let the violinist use your bodily fluids, and then after 9 months, the violinist will be able to survive without you. A lot of people say, well, it's permissible to get up and walk away, even if, let's just say, like, you're the only person that matches their like blood type or something, the only person in the world, or some stipulation where if you walk away, they'll die, right? A lot of people think you could walk away. I mean, maybe it's good to stay connected, but it's super erogatory. It's above and beyond your duties. So one thing that's interesting that I actually enjoyed was thinking about, do these arguments have implications for each other? Or if you really buy this singer drowning child thing, then should you actually stay connected to the violinist? Are you actually doing something morally wrong if you disconnect? Or you could push it the other way as well. You could say, well, maybe if you have this really strong intuition about the violinist, maybe we don't have the same obligations to save the child drowning. I mean, that seems pretty bad, right? But it's interesting to think kind of about how these thought experiments fit together. And I mean, this kind of relates back to sort of some of the things we were talking about with what intuitions do we trust. But I think, making sure our intuitions are consistent with each other, or if there's a difference in those cases, figuring out what that moral difference is, I think is really important, and hopefully something that the reader can get from the book.
Yeah, and I think to add to the kind of intersections here, there's vegan, like certain vegan vegetarian concerns, right? There's not only in the pond case donating your money, but then if you find out that a lot of your contributions to whether it be restaurants or something like Walmart contribute to some dead ill of society, right? To what extent do you how much should you limit your spending to these institutions? It's kind of like at the reverse, and especially in cases of where people are arguing for either veganism or some kind of form of vegetarianism.
Well, that gets really difficult too, because there are so many products, and it's not just one store, but there are like products that are being there's a lot of exploitation and stuff that happens with particular products. And so like if we, the animal products, but then there's also, like coffee and chocolate and some of the things that like, people are not getting a fair deal, and there's fair trade, but then you hear, there's even the fair trade is not very fair. And so there's like, just you can kind of get in one of those pond situations where there's, drowning children everywhere. And it's hard to sort out like how you can actually live and not be causing some issue or exploitation in the world.
And balancing too, like paying $20 for a small bag of coffee versus maybe giving that money to charity. Like, how do we, if we're spending way more on fair trade stuff, that could be taking away from money we could be doing, but elsewhere. It's very complicated. And we probably are just in moral dilemmas sometimes where we're just, like Rebecca said, like, there's just lots of morally bad options, and maybe we try to pick the best of the bad ones or something.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember if it was Grayling or Simon Blackburn, but they were talking about some threats to morality, and one of them is the feudalness, right? You might have a moral nihilist saying, "Look, guys, you can't. It's all arbitrary. There's not going to be a right or wrong answer as to how much you should spend at Walmart or how much you should donate." And so that's one of the concerns, right? That maybe some of these hypotheticals, rather than getting us to, okay, this is the right answer, there's like the scare that, is there even a right answer, right? And so I wanted to ask y'all towards the end of our discussion, how do you see the threat of moral nihilism? Are any of y'all sympathetic to a point where you just put it back and then you're just kind of writing impartially? Or I just wanted to get your thoughts on the nihilist perspective.
Well, I suppose most of the arguments in every direction that we consider assume, as it were, that moral nihilism is false. I guess that's sort of natural for an applied ethics textbook. An applied psychology or a psychology textbook is going to sort of assume that eliminativism about the mental is false, right? If a psychology textbook assumes that there are no such things as psychological states or moral states, it's going to be a very thin book. An applied ethics textbook that assumes that there's no such thing as morality is going to be a very, very thin book, which is good for the readers in some way. But it's not the view that most people hold, right? And I don't think any of us are moral nihilists. The discussion about whether morality is real or an illusion is a discussion in metaethics, a very abstract kind of level discussion, which we don't cover in the book. So we floated the idea of it in a second edition, maybe having a coda discussing some metaethics. Look, there are interesting arguments for the conclusion that morality is just an illusion, some sort of big error. There's no such thing as rightness or wrongness. I don't find those arguments very persuasive. I think there are answers to all of them. On the other hand, it's not like there are extremely powerful arguments for the opposite conclusion either. There are actually some arguments that, no, I should correct myself. I think that the arguments for the conclusion that there is moral stuff are better than the arguments for the opposite conclusion, right? But in any case, I would just go with the default view, where there is not a powerful philosophical argument for a radical conclusion, such as the conclusion that there's no such thing as morality. It seems imminently reasonable. It seems more rational just to go with what on the face of it, what looks to be right to begin with. There's really no other way about it. We have to have some starting point, and the starting point that, say, murder is wrong, or that torturing puppies for fun is wrong, or what have you, giving charity is a good thing, is much more plausible to me than any premise of any argument that I've ever seen for moral nihilism.
We've talked a lot about charity, and we've hardly touched on some of these topics, and I don't think we've mentioned the topic of punishment at all. And that section was really interesting to me because it actually introduced me to a controversy that I didn't know existed. So it was the idea, I've always kind of taken it for granted that criminals should be punished, but you actually kind of bring forward the different views about punishment and even introduce this, idea that, hey, maybe criminals shouldn't be punished, and kind of exploring those like different views about if, criminals should be punished, why. And so I thought that section was really interesting. Do you guys think that the arguments presented against punishment are compelling?
I guess I would say, I think, so Rebecca Chan, our co-author who's not here, wrote those chapters. I get the sense that she is maybe sympathetic to them, though I don't want to speak for her. I guess I would say myself, I probably think abolition is too far. It seems plausible to me that you're probably always going to have people who are threats to the rest of us. They're willing to murder, to assault, to steal, and so forth. You've got to do something about those folks, right? To keep them from doing it again, to deter other people, to assure the victims that we're concerned about what's happened, and so forth. Though I do think that in the U.S., the U.S. has, I think, something like 20% of the world's prison population and 4% of the people in the world. So it certainly is practical, because lots of other societies do it, to get by while incarcerating people a lot less, right? And that might involve partly, measures to try to prevent crime to begin with by giving people better opportunities. Might involve partly focusing on, rehabilitation and restorative justice, as opposed to just punitive things. Might involve, in some cases, decriminalizing things. I just moved to this new apartment, and I get junk mail addressed to previous people. And of course, since, as a law-abiding citizen, I always track those people down and forward the junk mail to them. But if I were to destroy any of that mail, I think that's like a felony. It's like obstructing the mail or something if you destroy somebody else's mail. So there are all sorts of crazy things that are illegal in the U.S. We're all felons, and that law is not enforced, maybe. But then there are other things like, laws against marijuana possession, where lots of people are in jail, and maybe that actually doesn't need to be illegal. So I guess I'm not sympathetic so much to the abolitionist perspective, but I am sympathetic maybe to the, you could do with a lot less incarceration perspective.
Thanks. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I guess I agree with Dustin. I think we probably overdo it in the US. But I, again, don't think that means that, especially in principle, we should never punish people that do wrong things, especially when those things are seriously hurting other people, or they're a threat to society or whatever. And I guess too, one way to think about the two different justifications of punishment that I think is helpful is to think of them. Some of them are backward looking and some of them are forward looking. So backward looking justifications, I think these are often roughly labeled as retributist views. And they basically say the people who actually did wrong things should be punished, regardless of what consequences that might lead to. And then there's forward looking views that see punishment much more in a utilitarian way. They basically say, look, punishment is this thing that we use to maybe try to prevent people from doing wrong things in the future, or we punish certain people maybe as an example to try to deter people from doing bad things. But it's the justification isn't because they did a bad thing in the past, but it's because we're looking to good consequences in the future. And so I think this is kind of a helpful way of seeing two of the main justifications for punishment. And I guess I don't know, maybe I shouldn't come out here and say this on YouTube, but I remember I was actually an undergraduate and I was at this summer seminar at Rutgers, and one of the guys was talking about punishment. And he was like, look, if we rely on utilitarian justifications for punishment, we can almost always justify, at least in some contrived scenarios, punishing completely innocent people. You can build up a scenario where punishing an innocent person will end up kind of having the best consequences for society. So I think one example that is in the literature is like, let's say like there was a murder in a town, maybe a really important person was murdered, and the town's just in a total uproar, and they're breaking windows and lighting things on fire, and everyone's just pissed off, and people are getting injured and maybe even dying because they want to figure out who killed this person. And there's like a homeless guy and he doesn't have any friends or family, and he didn't do it. But the mayor of the town is like, hey, I could frame this homeless guy and basically say, look, we found the killer. We threw him in jail. And that would cause way better like utility overall, even though obviously it's hurting this homeless guy's life. Like all these people in this town, like lives will be saved, people will stop getting destroyed, businesses will stop being ruined, etc. And at least from one perspective, when we're looking at it from like a forward-looking justification, it seems like there might be grounds to, in fact, punish him. And so for that reason, I find myself sort of sympathetic to retributive justifications, although I'm curious if other people would agree. I'm sure many people wouldn't.
Anybody want to respond? No? Okay. Do you guys have time for a couple of questions, or do we need to go ahead and close out?
I could stay for like 5-10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there were a couple questions here. Nidimus said, good and bad are mutually agreed labels with respect to a goal between agents. Is that a coherent enough view of moral pragmatism?
I guess it depends on what he means by, or what they mean by moral pragmatism. I guess I would say, I think we would all probably agree with this, that's probably not the correct view, that moral goodness and badness just are agents agreeing on something, because in fact, agents might agree on something bad, right? You could have, maybe in some societies, everybody in fact agreed, or the vast majority of people in fact agreed on slavery being a moral good, or the subjugation of women, or whatever. Or mistreatment of animals. So yeah, if the thought is something like it's just what people in fact agree on, then I think we would say that's probably not the right view of moral goodness and badness. Maybe it's something like, well, maybe it's what people would agree on if they were rational, fully informed. Maybe then you would move in the direction of some kind of contractualist picture. And then, that's something we talk about in the book.
But Dustin, maybe you're just giving arguments against moral pragmatism, or at least like maybe.
Well, yeah, sure. If pragmatism just means this sort of subjectivist whatever, then So this is why I said it depends on what you mean by moral pragmatism.
Yeah. And there's a related view a lot of people talk about that's like moral relativism, which is the view that morality is relative to persons or cultures or something. And a lot of philosophy professors, I think, like to give a bunch of arguments to their students about why moral relativism can't be right. And, I don't know if we need to go into all of that here, but it seems like there's moral progress in societies. It seems like the Nazis were just wrong about certain moral things. And so there's a lot of, I think, pretty core moral intuitions that views like moral relativism can't capture, and moral pragmatism might fall under a similar umbrella to that.
Foon42 says, what does the philosophical rational agent look like?
Kind of like Dustin. No, I'm kidding. All this. Not like me. Talking about looks, though, Another somebody else in the comments thread, and sorry to interrupt, I'll let Dustin or Liz answer that question seriously. But on the topic of seriousness,
where are we going with
somebody in the comments thread asked if our book has pictures, and I suppose it should be noted that we do actually have a handful of pictures of cats in the book.
One of them is of the cat. That's right.
Maybe you can show off the cat.
Yeah.
There's a cat and a dog in the stream, so we are very animal
The dog's very
friendly.
jumpy. I don't know if I can show off the dog.
You have a very cute dog, though. Oh,
One's on a
precious.
sleeve.
We don't even need to give arguments. Like you can't kill or torture that thing. Too cute. I think also someone in the chat said that I look like an elf. Don't know if that's a compliment, but
Oh my God.
just throwing that out there. Anyway, Dustin, maybe you should answer this question.
I think this is a matter of great disagreement, right? At least the agent will not like make mistakes in inferences, drawing inferences, or probabilistic reason, things like that. They won't commit logical fallacies. And presumably they'll demonstrate what's called means-ends rationality. So they'll take what they believe to be the most efficient means of accomplishing what they're trying to do. So if my goal is to get to Whole Foods, and I believe the most efficient means of doing that is getting in my car and driving there, then I'm not going to attempt to get to Whole Foods by climbing into the refrigerator. Say that would be irrational. Then there's a further question about whether there are substantive constraints on rationality. Could it be that not only are there constraints about the means you take to your ends, but are there constraints about what ends you should have? Someone who their sole desire is to be tortured forever along with everyone who loves them. It seems to me that that person is irrational. Even if they're not making any mistakes about how I tell them like, you're going to get tortured if you do this. And they're like, no, that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah, that person is demonstrating means ends rationality. Maybe they're taking a means to the end that they want. But they have a bad end. They have an irrational end. So some of us think that there are also constraints on what sorts of ends you should have. You can be rational or irrational.
No.
Reasonable or unreasonable ends. And then there's a whole big question about, so what are reasonable and unreasonable ends, of course. But you're
Rebecca,
muted.
you're muted.
You're muted, Rebecca.
Oh, sorry. For those who came in late, I just wanted to show the book again. This is the book we've been talking about, Applied Ethics, an Impartial Introduction. And this is a very good book. I highly recommend it, especially if you want to, discuss these topics that we've been talking about. Actually this discussion came about because me and Danny wanted to have a discussion about abortion. And I know that I hadn't read this, but I knew that they, Liz and the other authors had written a section on abortion. So, we actually will probably still have that talk. And we didn't really touch that much on abortion tonight. So I definitely want to delve into that topic. What's that?
We didn't speak about that much at all. Maybe another time.
Yeah. And that is probably the most controversial topic that, is in this book. So it's definitely one that I want to talk about on the channel. And thank you all for being here. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thanks everybody for participating in the chat. And does anybody have any final comments?
I just wanted to say thanks so much for having us. And also to the listeners, if you do get your hands on a copy of the book and you can leave us an Amazon review, that would be awesome. So that helps more people find the book. But I hope that
provided it's a 5-star.
Yeah. If it's less than 5 stars, But
you're,
I also
you're violating substantive constraints on rationality.
on rationality, yes.
if you give it.
But I was also just going to say that I agree that there was a lot we didn't cover, but hopefully that this is like a little commercial or like a long commercial. But you can see that there's quite a bit in the book, so I hope it encourages you to go buy it and check it out. So
yeah. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good night.